I'm going back to Bristol next month, and I'm a lecturer of law, so mine's coming from a legal perspective. I'm afraid, as usual, as lawyers are typically quite doom and gloom, so it's not the most uplifting presentation. But we'll try and just show you and give you a sense of really where there are what we'd say sort of biting provisions within FTAs that developing country parties might be able to use in order to sort of promote the standards that are contained within the FTAs. Okay, so the legal basis for social clauses is found in Article 21 of the Lisbon Treaty, and this essentially externalizes the role of the EU in terms of promoting democracy, the rule of law, the universality and indivisibility of human rights and fundamental freedoms, respect for human dignity, the principles of equality and solidarity, and respect for the principles of the UN Charter and international law. So what this means is that basically in all EU external policy, they must ensure that it is acting in a way that promotes these ideologies, so far as they are legally binding and enforceable. We also know from various different documents that the EU sees human rights as the silver thread of its free trade agreements and of its external action. And to this end, the trade must be guided by these values. In one of its recent strategy papers, we know that we've got the Strategy 2020. The idea is that trade and trade policy should reinforce the EU's international influence. And we're seeing sort of a bigger emphasis in particular through more recently negotiated FTAs, not only on human rights clauses, but on social clauses. And the distinction there is that human rights clauses focus on these core human rights provisions, be them, what I'll discuss later, be them first, second, or third generation rights, and also social clauses, which we as lawyers would define as labour standards and environmental standards. Okay, so in terms of the FTAs themselves, we have various different types of clauses within the free trade agreements. These are essential elements, implementation, non-execution, and jurisdiction clauses. I'll show you a few examples of essential elements clauses through some recently negotiated free trade agreements. But basically, the essential elements clause sets out the binding provision of the agreement and says that these are the commitments that the EU and the other party will conform to in the negotiation of trade. And as we see there, it's both commitments to human rights and also the principle of sustainable development. What I want you to bear in mind throughout this presentation is it's only a principle of sustainable development. This is not being recognised as a right in and of itself. Although the UN does recognise a right to development, this is not formally recognised as a human right. So it's debatable how enforceable these particular provisions are. The implementation clause merely relates to who will oversee implementation of the agreement once the agreement comes into force. So basically the joint council or committee, whoever is overseeing it, and that's a joint body which will comprise both EU members and members of the other party. We have a non-execution clause in, I think, pretty much every FTA that contains an essential elements clause. What that means is that if either party should breach the terms of the essential elements clause, the other party can invoke the non-execution clause. And that means they can stop trading, essentially, or stop concessions. But it must be an urgent response, and that is only temporary. It must then be removed once that threat has been removed. And the jurisdiction clause is just something that will appear, usually the non-execution and the jurisdiction clauses appear in Articles 200 to 300. They're quite far into the agreements themselves. And they deal with where the dispute might actually be decided. As we heard yesterday, a lot of the newer FTAs are being modelled around the dispute settlement system of the WTO. Certainly the EU Carry Forum EPA has a very similar system set up in terms of establishing a panel of experts to adjudicate on a dispute. And there are certain provisions in line there of how we deal with non-execution. So as an example, the EU-Korea FTA says that the parties confirm their attachment to democratic principles, human rights and fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law. Respect for democratic principles and human rights and fundamental freedoms, as laid down in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other relevant international human rights instruments, which reflect the principle of the rule of law, underpins the internal and international policies of both parties, and constitutes an essential element of this agreement. So that's where we see the binding commitments there. You'll see it differs slightly in the EU, Colombia, and Peru FTA. It's much shorter, it's not as extensive. We then have a much more comprehensive one in the Cotonou Partnership Agreement. This is perhaps the most complex essential elements clause in any of the EU's external trade agreements. I've only given you part of this from Article 9, it's actually a much longer provision. But what you can see is that it's a deep attachment to human dignity and human rights. It's already identifying that there are different types of rights, be them civil and political, economic, social, or cultural. The reason I also find Article 9 particularly interesting is that for one of the first times, the EU in a trade agreement is almost defining or giving some sense of what it perceives sustainable development to include. And what we see is that its cooperation should be directed towards sustainable development centered on the human person, who is the main protagonist and beneficiary of development. This entails respect for and promotion of all human rights. So for any of the economic partnership agreements negotiated under the key of the Cotonou Partnership Agreement, there is actually some scope perhaps for where a breach or a material breach of a sustainable development principle occurs. They could perhaps invoke this on human rights grounds because of this provision in Article 9. In the CARIFORUM EPA, Article 3.1 gives us the essential elements in terms of sustainable development and reiterates Articles 1, 2, and 9. And what we see in Article 3 of the Cotonou Partnership linking in with this is that the parties will ensure the fulfilment of the obligations and facilitate the attainment of those objectives. So there has to be commitment from both sides. Most importantly, they'll refrain from any measures that are liable to jeopardize that. So it's very far-reaching. In legal terms, it's extremely vague, it's extremely broad, and at the moment, there has been no real action brought under these agreements because they're all relatively new. And most importantly, you have to establish a material breach. So you wouldn't be able to bring any legal claim against the EU or the EU against the other party unless either party can establish a material breach has occurred. And from a legal perspective, this is quite interesting because what you would need to do is to establish some kind of, oh, it's disappeared, I had a slide about this, a causal connection basically between liberalisation and any positive or negative effect on human rights in that country. That's going to be extremely difficult to prove, to show that liberalisation under a particular trade agreement has resulted in negative or positive human rights impacts. There's a lot of literature around human rights impact assessments, but the main problem we have at the moment is that there doesn't seem to really be a suitable methodology in place to actually measure the impacts of liberalisation and those effects on human rights, the realisation of rights. And more often than not, the free trade agreements between the EU and its partner countries lack an operational mechanism or institutional framework to properly safeguard those rights. So how might they actually challenge any kind of potential breach? Well, the non-execution clause, as I mentioned earlier, provides them with a legal framework to work with. But what we see here is that the essential elements clause has been used by the EU against partner countries 23 times, all of which countries have been in the ACP region. Very few have actually had sanctions against them. So what the EU is very keen to do is to engage in political dialogue with those countries to try and bring their behaviour up to the appropriate standard. And you're going to be hearing all about labour standards and everything else later. They can also suspend concessions, as I said, in urgent cases, but there are various lengthy steps that have to be proven first before you can actually take that action. So perhaps an alternative, and what we've seen within the legal system actually, is rather than trying to bring any claim at all under a free trade agreement, is to actually bring a claim through a different legal avenue. We've seen that the Alien Torts Act in the US has been an extremely popular mechanism, and this has allowed many interest groups to bring human rights abuse claims that have been committed by various companies. So say, for example, in Nigeria, there's just been a massive settlement paid out to the Ogoni people by the damage that was caused by Royal Dutch Shell. There are lots of other cases that have gone through the Alien Torts Act, but the US is keen to now try and restrict this because its territorial jurisdiction is quite interesting. Another idea would be to shift the idea from state-based responsibility to corporate social responsibility, because in fact, what I failed to tell you is in order to raise a breach of human rights, you have to raise that against the state. More often than not, when we're talking about free trade areas, or free trade agreements, the perpetrators of any kind of human rights violation will actually probably be a multinational corporation. So it's very unlikely that anyone will successfully bring a claim against the EU or the partner country on that basis. We now have the UN guiding principles which operate on 3 pillars: that states must protect human rights, that businesses must respect human rights, and that anybody harmed must be able to claim an effective remedy. What that means is that through the free trade agreement, if they're unable to effectively claim a material breach, they could actually pursue the multinational corporation who has committed that violation through their own domestic court. And usually it's for criminal damages. Or it could be for tortious liability, which basically means they've breached their duty of care in respect to your human rights. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much. And I think this is very complementary with the next paper, actually, that deals with similar questions, but then more from